that the literary, without losing its fictional character, present the perception of the landscape and the recreation or interpretation of social relations, historical social processes, ancestral memories and traditions. And of course, as a piece of art, each production is expected to be an expression of the author's imagination. Building on these postulates, I invite you to accompany me to take a brief overview of the literature about Black people written by authors of Central American descent. The presence of Africans and their descendants in Central America is contemporary with the coming of the Spanish. The first group was the so-called Latinos, descendants of Africans living in Portugal or Spain, and which were already incorporated into the Iberian society. In the mid-16th century, for example, Algarve was almost entirely populated by Black people, and in 1552, it was estimated that of the residents of Lisbon was around 100,000 people, out of which 10,000 were Black. So the ladies used to go to the market with 5 or 6 slaves surrounding them. Right? But the bulk of Africans came to the Americas directly from Africa, brought forcefully to take the place of the decreasing indigenous population as a result of the population catastrophe, infringed on Native Americans by European warfare, diseases, displacements, and miscegenation. The African population influx, as well as is well documented in works of authors such as Rina Cáceres, Lawrence Godmanson, and others. In 1542, there is already a significant contingent of Black people in Central America, and by 1560, the first runaway groups of runaway slaves appears, establishing maroon communities in Bayano, Panama, later in El Salvador and Guatemala. As a matter of fact, according to the researches by Christopher Lutz, Afro-descendants became the fastest growing population sector in Santiago, the capital of the Kingdom of Guatemala, with the same high numbers in various locations in the provinces of Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica. Now, the social dynamics of Central America during the colonial times led to the mixing of both enslaved and free populations, and by successive mixtures developed an interesting community of Black and Afro-mestizos, which I prefer to use the word Afro-mestizos instead of mulattoes, because of the mule connotation. Some of these learned very well the game of the Central American economy and serve as horsemen, farmers, artisans, artists, military, and architects. Toward the end of the 18th century, a group of Maroons, after establishing and holding a free Maroon state for many years on the island of St. Vincent, were finally defeated by the British and transferred en masse in 1797 to the Honduran island of Roatan. This group, called originally Black Carrot and later Garifunas, then spread to Belize, Guatemala, and Nicaragua. The unique body of Afro-Central American literature of that time, of course, is oral. The Africans brought and developed their stories in accordance with their traditions. Afro-oral literature is part of a rich tradition which has its genesis in West Africa. The idea to transmit myths about the creation of the world, sexual differentiation, the beginning of civilization, and ethical postulates at large in the Caribbean. This letter left behind some of the original myths as they had been replaced by Christian ideology, at the same time favoring astuteness as a supreme resource for the survival of enslaved communities. Then once slavery was over, the stories turned towards strong moralist positions. Also during the colonial period, a mestizo kingdom developed in Nicaragua's Caribbean coast. Chipcha, indigenous Chipcha base, mixing with black men who escaped from a slave ship en route to Mexico, thus integrating the Afro-indigenous ethnia. In Central America, intense mestizaje led to syncretism, reconstructing and construction of new manifestations of culture in many regions. The historical memory has been lost, but the oral traditions are preserved. For example, it is, a good example. In the case of Costa Rica, where we have two, of course, the same story. We've listened here to the colonial blacks and the West Indian. The colonial black people gradually mixed with the local population, lost this historical memory. Okay? But it's very interesting that there's one story now, there's several, but one story that I want to use as an example that was collected by somebody else in the Central Valley, where they tend to say that they are white population and no relation with the blacks and so on. And another story that I collected myself in the Atlantic Zone. It's exactly the same story, only that in the Caribbean, in the Mon, it is a Nancy, a Brother Nancy, while in the Central Valley is Brother Rabbit. But the story is exactly the same. After getting a job to guard the very farm from which he was stealing every night, Brother Nancy, our Brother Rabbit, was entrapped and whipped by the collectivity. Or there's another one, a Nancy tricking Brother Tiger to prove to two beautiful sisters that the tiger was his riding horse. Those are, it's a very universal story that we find it all over, including Europe. Black Europeans. Now, the building and development of national state. Once independence was achieved, the Central American elite that controlled power set about to construct white national states. For this reason, they stimulated ideological processes that would lead to whiten the population or to be colorblind. Imbued with the dominant ideology of the time, according to which the opposition between civilization and barbarism was inevitable. They sought to place themselves as part of the white civilization. This they did by creating an ideal Europe, phenomenon to which I have applied the term Europhilia. Rejecting local cultural diversity, ethnophobia, and underestimating and despising their own culture, endophobia. The whitening ideology led to such atrocities as retouching the portraits of heroes and prominent people of African or indigenous descent. We have the case of Ruben Dario. You can find this on the web as an article by Lauren Goodmanson. There are 3 portraits of Ruben Dario. When he was very young, starting his career, the typical Afro-Latin. You can see the hair, etc., etc. When you get a little more fame, the features start changing, and the hair was smoothing. And by the time he was very famous and well known the world over, he was just exactly like a German. So they did this by creating an ideal Europe, phenomenon to which I have applied the term Europhilia. The whitening ideology, I said, led to such atrocities as retouching the portraits of heroes and prominent people of African or indigenous descent. And in those cases in which phenotypic trait was overwhelmingly evident, they tend to neutralize the color aspects with the use of attributives. We are all Honduran, we are all Nicaraguans, without any color differences. Another idealistic solution